Las Vegas is not running out of water in the future, it is running out of water right now, silently, invisibly, every second that passes. The level of the lake that keeps this entire city alive is dropping, and the most dangerous part is that almost no one living there truly understands how close the system is to failure. Because from the outside, everything still looks normal. The lights are still on, the fountains are still dancing, tourists are still arriving, people are still filling swimming pools in the middle of a desert that was never meant to support life. At this scale, and that illusion of normalcy is exactly what makes this situation so dangerous. Because systems don't collapse when people panic, systems collapse when people assume everything is fine. Las Vegas depends on a single source of water, one lake, Lake Mead, and that lake has been in decline for more than 2 decades, not because of one bad year, not because of one drought, but because the entire system feeding it is fundamentally broken. The river that supplies it, Colorado River, is being asked to provide more water than it physically has. And it has been that way for nearly a century, which means this is not a temporary crisis. This is a slow-moving structural failure that has been building for generations, hidden behind growth, masked by engineering, delayed by temporary solutions. And now it is reaching a point where those solutions are no longer enough. Because when Las Vegas was built, it was built on an assumption that turned out to be false. The assumption that water would always be there, that the river would always flow, that the lake would always refill, and for decades that assumption appeared to be true, which allowed the city to grow faster than almost anyone thought possible. But the growth was never the real problem. The problem was the math behind it, because the numbers used to divide the river were based on one of the wettest periods in recorded history. And those numbers became law, locked into agreements that still control how water is distributed today, even though the reality has changed completely, and that gap between assumption and reality is where the crisis begins. Because today, more than 40 million people across multiple states depend on the same river system. Cities like Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Los Angeles are all pulling from the same shrinking source, along with massive agricultural operations that consume enormous amounts of water to sustain food production. And when demand keeps increasing while supply keeps decreasing, the system doesn't stabilize. It destabilizes, slowly at first, then all at once. And Las Vegas just happens to be the most visible pressure point in that system, because unlike other cities that have multiple water sources, Las Vegas is almost entirely dependent on Lake Mead, which means when the lake drops, the city feels it immediately, and that is exactly what has been happening year after year, the water level falling, exposing more of the lakebed, leaving behind a visible white ring along the canyon walls that marks how much water has been lost. A geological scar that grows wider every year, a visual reminder that the system is not holding, it is failing. And by 2022, the situation had reached a level that forced engineers and policymakers to confront a reality they had been trying to delay for decades, because the lake dropped so low that the original infrastructure designed to extract water from it was no longer reliable. Intake pipes that once sat comfortably below the waterline were suddenly approaching the surface, meaning that if the decline continued, they would stop working entirely, not because the pipes were broken, but because the water they were built to reach would no longer be there. And that is a very different kind of failure, because you cannot repair it, you cannot fix it with maintenance, you cannot upgrade it with better technology. If the water is gone, the system is gone. And that is the moment when Las Vegas realized it was not dealing with a temporary shortage, it was facing an existential risk. Because losing access to water is not like losing access to power or fuel. There is no substitute, there is no backup plan that can be deployed at scale quickly enough to support millions of people. And that is why the response was so extreme, because the city was not trying to improve its system, it was trying to prevent collapse. And that is how one of the most ambitious engineering projects in modern American history began. A project designed not to solve the problem, but to survive it. A project that would push infrastructure beyond its original limits, reaching deeper than any previous system had ever gone, into parts of the lake that were never meant to be accessed, into reserves that were never part of the original design, because when the surface disappears, the only direction left is down, and that is exactly what they did. They drilled beneath the lake, through solid rock, creating a tunnel that extended miles into the earth, connecting the city to a deeper intake point that could continue pulling water even if the lake dropped to levels that would render all previous systems useless. It was called the third straw, and it represented something much larger than a construction project. It represented a shift in strategy, from assuming stability to preparing for failure, from building for growth to building for survival, and for a moment it worked. The new intake secured access to water that had previously been out of reach, buying the city time, restoring confidence, allowing life to continue as if the crisis had been managed. But that sense of security was misleading, because the third straw did not create new water. It only allowed access to water that was already there, and that distinction matters. Because it means the underlying problem was never solved, it was only postponed, and postponing a structural problem does not eliminate it, it compounds it. Because while the city was extending its access, the river feeding the lake was continuing. To weaken, the climate patterns that once supported consistent flow were becoming more unpredictable. Snowfall in the mountains that supply the river was declining in reliability. Evaporation rates were increasing due to rising temperatures, and demand across the entire system was still growing, meaning that every factor that contributed to the decline was still active, still accelerating, still pushing the system closer to its limits. And this is where the story becomes bigger than Las Vegas, because what is happening here is not an isolated crisis. It is a preview, a real-time example of what happens when infrastructure built for one set of conditions is forced to operate under a completely different reality. When long-term assumptions break, when natural systems change faster than human systems can adapt, when growth outpaces sustainability, and when solutions are designed to delay consequences rather than address causes, because the deeper you look into the numbers, the more uncomfortable the situation becomes. The Colorado River no longer produces enough water to meet the commitments that were made decades ago. Yet those commitments still exist, enforced by legal agreements that do not adjust automatically to changing conditions, which means that even as the total supply shrinks, the system continues to allocate water as if nothing has changed, creating a structural deficit that grows every year, and that deficit has to be absorbed somewhere. It shows up in falling reservoir levels, in stricter water restrictions, in political conflicts between states, and eventually in hard decisions about who gets water and who does not. And those decisions are not theoretical, they are already happening. Negotiations between states have become more tense. Emergency measures have been introduced to reduce consumption, and federal agencies have been forced to intervene to prevent the system from reaching critical thresholds. But these actions are reactive, not preventative. They are responses to a problem that is already in motion, not solutions that eliminate it. And that is why the third straw is both impressive and unsettling at the same time, because it demonstrates what human engineering is capable of. But it also reveals the limits of that capability, because no matter how deep you drill, no matter how advanced your infrastructure becomes, you cannot extract water that does not exist. And that is the boundary the system is approaching, a point where technology can no longer compensate for environmental decline. And when that point is reached, the choices become much more difficult, because they are no longer about efficiency or optimization. They are about allocation and survival. And that is where the concept of water wars begins to move from theory to reality, not necessarily in the form of open conflict, but in the form of economic pressure, political negotiation, legal battles, and resource prioritization, because when a critical resource becomes scarce, every system built around it starts to compete. Agriculture, urban development, energy production, all of them depend on water, and all of them cannot be sustained at the same level if the supply continues to decline, which means something has to change, and the question is not whether that change will happen, but how. Whether it will be managed gradually through policy and conservation, or forced suddenly through crisis and collapse. And Las Vegas sits directly in the middle of that question because it has already done many of the things that experts recommend. It has improved water efficiency, reduced per capita consumption, implemented recycling systems that allow water to be reused multiple times, and invested heavily in infrastructure to secure its supply. Yet, despite all of that, the risk remains because the problem is larger than any single city. The collapse of the modern water system in the American West did not begin with drought. It began with a decision, a document signed over a century ago that quietly shaped the future of millions of people without fully understanding the limits of the system it was trying to control. In 1922, representatives from 7 U.S. states came together to divide the waters of the Colorado River, and what they created became known as the Colorado River Compact, an agreement that would go on to determine who gets water, how much they get, and when they get it. And at the time it seemed like a rational solution to a growing problem. The American West was expanding, cities were emerging, agriculture was scaling, and there was a need to create order out of what was previously a shared natural resource. But the foundation of that agreement was built on a critical assumption. An assumption that would later prove to be one of the most expensive miscalculations in modern infrastructure history, because the data used to divide the river came from a period of unusually high rainfall, one of the wettest cycles the region had experienced, which made the river appear far more abundant than it actually was over the long term. And instead of accounting for variability, instead of building a system that could adapt to changing conditions, the agreement locked those optimistic numbers into law, effectively over-allocating the river from the very beginning, promising more water than the system could sustainably provide. And for decades, that flaw remained hidden because the conditions that created the illusion of abundance did not disappear immediately. The river continued to flow, reservoirs filled, cities grew, and the system appeared to function as intended. But beneath that surface stability, a deficit was quietly accumulating. Year after year, a gap between how much water was being used and how much was actually being replenished. And that gap did not stay constant. It expanded because demand did not remain static. It increased, populations grew, industries expanded, agricultural production intensified, and every new layer of demand added more pressure to a system that was already overcommitted. And this is where the illusion becomes dangerous. Because when a system works under favorable conditions, it creates confidence. And that confidence encourages further expansion, which increases dependency, which reduces flexibility. And by the time the conditions change, the system is too large, too interconnected, and too essential to scale back easily. And that is exactly what happened across the American West. Cities like Las Vegas, Phoenix, and Los Angeles built their growth models around a river that was assumed to be reliable, and when that assumption began to break, the consequences did not appear immediately. They emerged gradually in the form of declining reservoir levels, increased competition for water, and growing tension between states, because the compact did not just allocate water, it created a hierarchy, dividing the basin into upper and lower regions, assigning fixed shares that did not automatically adjust when supply decreased, which means that when there is less water, the system does not evenly distribute the shortage. It forces certain areas to absorb more of the impact than others, and that creates conflict, not necessarily visible conflict, but structural conflict embedded in policy, negotiation, and economic pressure, because every state depends on that allocation to sustain its own population and economy. And reducing access is not just an environmental issue, it is a political and financial one, affecting jobs, industries, and long-term development. And as the river's flow began to decline due to a combination of overuse and changing climate patterns, those tensions intensified because now the system was no longer managing abundance, it was managing scarcity, and scarcity changes everything. It shifts priorities, it exposes weaknesses, and it forces decisions that were previously avoidable. And one of the most significant indicators of that shift is what has been happening to Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States, designed to store excess water during wet periods and release it during dry ones, effectively acting as a buffer for the entire system. But a buffer only works if it can refill, and for the past 2 decades, Lake Mead has been losing more water than it gains, not because of a single factor, but because of a combination of reduced inflow, increased evaporation, and sustained demand. And as the water level drops, it reveals more than just the physical landscape. It reveals the limitations of the system itself, because reservoirs are not infinite. They are storage mechanisms, and once the stored resource is depleted, the system loses its ability to compensate for variability, which means that every fluctuation in supply has a more immediate and more severe impact. And that is exactly what engineers and policymakers have been trying to avoid, because once a reservoir like Lake Mead drops below certain thresholds, it triggers a cascade of consequences, affecting not just water supply, but also energy production. Since the Hoover Dam relies on water flow to generate hydroelectric power, and when water levels fall below the intake points, both water extraction and power generation become compromised, creating a situation where multiple systems begin to fail simultaneously. And this is where the concept of dead pool becomes critical, a term used to describe the point at which water can no longer flow downstream through the dam, effectively rendering the reservoir useless for its primary functions. And that threshold is not theoretical. It is a measurable elevation, a line that engineers track closely because crossing it represents a fundamental breakdown in the system. And while the third straw was designed to extend Las Vegas's access to water below traditional intake levels, it does not eliminate the dead pool threshold for the broader system, because once the river itself cannot sustain flow, the problem extends beyond any single city's infrastructure. And this is where the narrative shifts from local crisis to regional instability, because the Colorado River Basin supports a vast network of cities, farms, and ecosystems, all interconnected, all dependent on the same declining resource. And as pressure increases, the system begins to show signs of strain in the form of emergency declarations, mandatory water cuts, and renegotiations of long-standing agreements. And these are not minor adjustments. They are indicators that the existing framework is no longer sufficient to manage the current reality. And yet, changing that framework is incredibly complex, because it involves multiple states, federal agencies, legal contracts, and competing interests, each with its own priorities and constraints, which means that even when the need for change is clear, the process of implementing it is slow, and in a system where conditions are changing rapidly, slow responses create additional risk. Because the gap between policy and reality continues to widen, and that gap is where instability grows. Because when the rules governing a system no longer match the conditions it operates under, the system becomes unpredictable, and unpredictability is one of the most dangerous states for any critical infrastructure, because it makes planning difficult, increases the likelihood of failure, and reduces the effectiveness of response strategies. And this is why the story of Las Vegas is not just about a city adapting to a water shortage. It is about a system struggling to reconcile its past assumptions with its present reality, a system that was designed for stability now operating under constant stress. And the deeper you look into the mechanics of that system, the more you realize that the problem is not a single point of failure. It is a network of interdependent factors, each contributing to the overall risk, from climate variability to legal constraints, from population growth to resource allocation, all interacting in ways that are difficult to predict and even harder to control. And that complexity is what makes the situation so challenging, because there is no simple solution, no single action that can restore balance. Instead, it requires a combination of strategies, conservation, innovation, policy reform, and perhaps most importantly, a willingness to confront uncomfortable realities about the limits of growth and the sustainability of existing systems. Because as long as those realities are ignored, the system will continue to operate under false assumptions. And those assumptions will continue to drive decisions that increase risk, and eventually that risk reaches a point where it can no longer be managed incrementally, where the system is forced into a state of rapid adjustment, and that is the moment when stability breaks. And while Las Vegas has managed to delay that moment through aggressive infrastructure and conservation efforts, it has not eliminated it, because the underlying issue, the imbalance between supply and demand, still exists, and as long as that imbalance remains, the system will continue to move toward a point of correction, whether gradual or sudden, and that is the trajectory that defines the future of the Colorado River Basin. Not a single event, but an ongoing process of adjustment, driven by forces that extend beyond any individual city or project, shaping the availability of one of the most critical resources in the region, and determining how millions of people will adapt to a reality that is very different from the one that was assumed when the system was first created.